Do it.
We might still have other people filtering in, but welcome everyone who is here now. I guess I'll just introduce and say a welcome. So my name is Nicole. I work for silviculture. I do design work and help out with organizing workshops and a lot of different projects that come up. We also have Jane here, who is the executive director, and Michael is the technical coordinator. He's going to be speaking today. And
you went mute.
For the future. And can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. So I am just going to go ahead and introduce Michael and invite him to share a little bit more about himself and get started.
All right. So I'm Michael Judd. I have worked with perennial tree crops, permaculture systems now for more than 2 decades. And in the course of working, in many parts of the world with tree crops, nut trees have really stood out for the return on energy in for the energy out. And some of the places I've lived in the world, people literally relied on the food that they could grow and that grew around them. There was no stores, no grocery stores. And when you're in that kind of reality, it becomes very clear what is worth putting energy into and what kind of returns you get. So nuts stand out as being comparatively low input and high output compared to annual crops, even a lot of berry crops. And they're also resilient. They're more resilient to changing weather patterns, inclement weather, things that can wipe out annual crops very easily. So there's a combination here that attracts me to working with nuts, and that's that low input, consistent yields, and all the other benefits that having perennial food sources create. They help hold the soil in place. They help create year-round perennial habitat for beneficial insects and critters. So they help balance the ecology, the insect ecology for the region. They feed all of life. A couple of you guys aren't muted. Please mute everybody. They feed, they feed the whole ecosystem. One way or another, so many animals, humans rely on the nut crops that then trickles down throughout the whole ecosystem. So as I've worked with, all these different growing systems and species, over the years in both the tropics and in the temperate zones, it narrows down, at least for me, that the nut trees are one of the greatest gifts that we have, and planting them is a gift to the future. Trees living hundreds of years. So I also am always kind of looking at my life and questioning, what can I do with my time here that is going to, bring as much benefit to as many as possible. And that narrows down to nut trees. There's other things I'm a big fan of, and I do like to mix my planting systems, but it really does come down to nut trees. And then within nut trees, it has come down even more specifically to the chestnuts. And there's many reasons for that, which we're going to talk about tonight. But the chestnut is also known as the bread tree. It is, let me see, I'm jumping too fast there. So it's known as the bread tree because it has a very high carbohydrate level in it. It is almost twice the amount of starch as potatoes. So this is a wonderful quality for also storing chestnuts. Once they're dried, they can be stored for a year or two because they have very little to no oil in them. So they can be ground up into flour. They can be dried and put into soups. They make great pastries. It's literally a survival food, and it has proven that even in the last century, where during World War II, a lot of places in France and Italy were cut off from outside resources, and they literally survived by eating chestnuts. Now, chestnuts was already a big part of their culture, but it came down to literally being what saved many communities. And likewise, here in the U.S., especially along the eastern seaboard, the indigenous peoples relied heavily on nuts and the chestnut. They would selectively burn and thin the forests. Some say that the entire eastern seaboard was somewhat managed by indigenous peoples at one point. And a lot of that selection was for the nut trees, not only for being able to harvest and collect and store those nuts for eating, but because of the wildlife that they fed, that then they could hunt. So the history of the nuts and the survival of the human species is very closely linked and documented. And I'm always looking a little bit into the future, especially since I've had children. And there's a lot we don't know about what's coming. But I'm always trying to think about, okay, well, again, what can I do that might create a lasting resource and economy? And again, nut trees. It is one of the most secure things, whether, whichever way our economies go, whichever way, our environmental weather goes, one of the best, most stable bets that I can think of, and I've thought a lot about it, are the nut trees. So that's the future, but even in the short term, they offer wonderful returns economically and environmentally. So that's kind of the overview of why I'm nuts about nuts, and specifically the chestnut. So let's get into this and be clear about what kind of chestnuts we're talking about. There's a large movement for sort of bringing back, restoring the American chestnut. Now, the American chestnut had a powerful presence, especially in Appalachia and the eastern seaboard, where some say that one in every 3 trees was a chestnut. It was that prevalent, and oftentimes growing in large groves, really dominating entire mountainsides. And as many of you know, learned around the turn of the last century, there was a fungus, a blight that got introduced, and pretty much it started wiping out the American chestnut, and then the American government went and finished them off. A lot of people think they jumped the gun. Since they were being infected, they said, well, let's cut them all down to make sure. And so maybe we would have had some resistance, and maybe they would have made it. But anyway, that's not what happened. So all the trees either died or were cut down, which had a devastating effect. If you can imagine, 1 in every 3 trees in our forests, dying or being cut down, and trees that were magnificent, mass trees, 100 feet tall, and produced tons of nuts. Now, they're smaller nuts than what we're used to seeing in the stores, but they're very tasty. I've eaten American chestnuts, and they're very sweet and very tasty, but they're small. And we'll get back, to why that's a bit of a challenge, as far as really growing and harvesting chestnuts. But anyway, so we're not talking about the American chestnut. Silviculture is not focused on really any genetics doing with American chestnut. There is also here in America the Allegheny chinkapin, and a subspecies of that, the Ozark chinkapin. It is more of a multi-stemmed woody shrub, which does survive the blight and produces very sweet nuts, and actually a single nut in each burr. And it's able to survive because it can reshoot stems, right? They do get diseased, but they die. And as being a shrub, it's able to, to sort of reshoot and refruit. So, that there still is some interest in working with this species, and some of the current chestnut gurus and gurus are crossing the Allegheny with some of the Asian chestnuts and coming up with maybe some potentially interesting mixes. But moving along, the European chestnut is a larger tree. It's usually about 60 feet tall. Sorry, I say larger in comparison to what we're getting to, which is the Chinese chestnut, not the American. So the European chestnut does really well in Europe. It has large nuts, very tasty. There are some challenges. There's a thin skin that sticks over the nut called the pellicle on a chestnut. And some species and some of the genetics within the species have that pellicle sticking very tightly and going into the grooves. And it's bitter. So it's actually a bit of a challenge that the European chestnuts are known for. So, but the European chestnuts do not grow well currently in the mid-Atlantic. Our high humidity and high levels of blight challenge it. Now on the West Coast, it is being grown in Washington State and Northern California and areas like that. Okay, so then there's the Japanese chestnut. So the Japanese chestnut is similar, in size to the European, and has actually a very large nut, but that some will say is not as flavorful. So there's a spectrum here, even in the flavor of the chestnuts, and even the flesh, either being a little more bland or some being very crunchy and very sweet, which the American chestnut is like that, and certainly the Chinese chestnut is delicious, absolute dessert. And I had the good fortune at the beginning of my interest with the chestnuts to do a blind taste test where I had an American, a European, a Japanese, and a Chinese and chestnut. And so I got to try them without knowing what they were. And I chose the Chinese chestnut and the American chestnut as being sort of the sweetest and tastiest. So that's just me. A lot of people will defend their favorite kind of chestnut. So maybe one way to think about the chestnut is kind of, like our own species started, with one mother. I believe that the chestnut at some point, in the Earth's history began, and then as the Earth divided apart, it adapted into modern day, what we call North America, Europe, Asia. But really, we're talking about a very connected, species within. So they readily hybridize. They readily cross. They don't have borders with each other. They're not really sort of very separate at the core. They've just adapted differently. Now, the Chinese chestnut tree is a gorgeous landscape tree. It typically grows to about 30 to 40 feet. It has a beautiful umbrella shape canopy. I'm going to show you some pictures here in a minute. What I sort of call edible landscape all-stars. And for me, to be an edible landscape all-star, it's got to be easy to grow, it's got to be attractive, and it's got to be productive. And the Chinese chestnut hits all of those. Very tough, very fast, resilient tree. Chestnut in general is a very tough, resilient tree, often growing on very steep hillsides and dry soil. Now, I'm not saying I recommend that, but to show you that they do thrive even in harsh conditions is a great attribute for the chestnut around the world. So hybrid chestnuts, there are endless combinations of hybrid chestnuts. Like I say, they readily cross-pollinate, and people work with them by crossing them and experimenting to see what will work well. The ones you hear a lot about are things like Colossal. It's a European Japanese. It's more popular out in the West, not really proven well to do here. Paragon's one of the first experimentations with the American and European. Maybe some of you have heard of the Dunstan chestnut. The Dunstan chestnut is a very popular chestnut in the Southeast. It was discovered in North Carolina and has sort of really housed itself out of a group in Florida now that grow them. So they'll grow a little bit more in that Southeast humidity and heat. And they claim it's got American in it, but to me, it looks Chinese. Now within Chinese chestnuts, China's a big country, right? So there's very different climates in the north, the south, the east, the west. So even within China, there's a lot of genetics of chestnuts to choose from, which is great because we can find analogs within our own country in each zone for some of those genetics. And the Chinese culture has worked intimately with the chestnut, for millenniums, for an unfathomable amount of time. And that's how they actually have it more as an orchard-sized tree. Who knows what it might have started out with, but they selected and kept working with it to get it to, fit good harvests, consistent harvests, good size, good flavor, all these wonderful characteristics. We owe so much in general to the Chinese culture for some of the most amazing plants and horticulture and foods that we have today. They have an ancient wisdom when it comes to plants. So the Chinese chestnut for our region is definitely at this stage the best genetics. And by that I mean that they're disease resistant, they're blight resistant. So they can still be affected by it, but they continue to thrive. They are heavy producers. Trees can be up to 100 pounds of fruit per year. So they're annual producers. Being annual is very important. A lot of nut trees will mast, meaning they'll produce every 2 or every 3 years. The chestnut produces every year in high abundance of very nutrient storable food that has a very high economic value as well, which we're going to talk about. So I just wanted to clarify there a little bit. We do say hybrid chestnut in general, but really we're talking about Chinese chestnuts. Aha, there we go. Look at that beauty. This is just down the road from our house here in Frederick, Maryland. This is in Maryland. This is a 60-year-old Chinese chestnut orchard that is absolutely gorgeous. Look at that tree. I mean, it's beautiful. And it's in flower there. So it's just extra radiant. And then I think another picture here. And look at these groves. The almost park-like beauty that having chestnuts creates in its own right is reason to be working with and planting them. The spacing in here is about 40 foot by 40 foot. And you can see the trees are already beginning to touch each other after 60 years. And we'll talk a little bit about spacing, but generally, 40-foot spacing is good for about 50 years. And then you want to really start even thinking about thinning. At 100 years, you're going to want to thin again. At 500 years, you're going to want to thin again. So you basically have like 4 trees per acre. Remember, these trees live for hundreds of years. They produce, and give life for such a long, long time. And they're very fast growers. So these guys are very quick grown, very productive. They can start producing at year 6. And they really start hitting stride around year 10 and really get into mature production by year 15. We'll talk a little bit about that again. This is a map of that orchard that is, I would say the chestnuts in the orchard, we're probably talking about 8 acres. And it's not been used. It's been kind of left a bit, it's been mowed. So we're now at silviculture coming in there and starting to sample, test the genetics in there, learning, the processing with them, sort of scratching our teeth in a way on a mature orchard, which has been a great learning resource for us. Now, 60 years ago, the genetics for, the Chinese chestnut have come a long way in our country. And a lot of that is by a handful of people who have really been growing these out and selecting and thinning. Again, there's a large genetic pool to take from. So we have gotten to a point, thanks to some of these pioneers like Greg Miller, at Route 9 Cooperative, and the University of Missouri has done a lot of research, orchard research, to start to narrow down, okay, what are some of these most productive, disease-resistant, tasty chestnuts that are commercially viable. Commercially viable is very important here because we are working toward, making this a successful economic venture to stimulate the end result, which is, these forests of tree crops. So economics are very much at the forefront of our focus, noticing that that's the realism that will make more people plant them. And so this orchard is mostly older genetics. There's a few trees in here that we think do have good promise, and we hopefully will be able to salvage those genetics, keep growing those out, along with the genetics that we're getting from Route 9 Cooperative, the University of Missouri, and a few others that are taking focus on commercially viable chestnuts. Beautiful flowers that flower late, which is nice. They can avoid a lot of the frost issues from early flowering. That said, it's good to not plant your chestnuts in a frost pocket, sort of at the bottom of a hill. That's typically a frost pocket, because the buds before they flower can be damaged by the frost. So typically we want to keep them upslope a little bit. The two main factors is not having them in wet soil and maybe avoiding frost pockets. So really we're looking at rolling hills up to steep hills for these. And we'll talk a little bit more about the soil types that we're after. But generally speaking, they're quite forgiving as long as they don't have wet feet. The wet feet will probably end up, killing your trees. Abundant production. The burrs often have 2 or 3 nuts in them. Some trees have the characteristic of opening their burrs in the tree and dropping nuts, which can have some benefit. But then them staying in the husk have benefit too, because that's kind of the protection to make sure you get some before the critters do. But either way, you've got to deal with these spiky, husks. Which is one of the reasons, I don't recommend planting these, right outside your back door. Put it in the corner where you're not walking around. But yeah, you want to watch out for the spiky burrs. It's a mixed blessing. And there's 3 nuts that, that we pulled from a single burr. That's quite common shape to have those rounded on the end and a flat nut in the middle. Sometimes you will get 2, like I say, and that can be a characteristic of a certain tree to look for. Let's see. And then of course, they come in a variety of sizes. They do, when you're working with them for market, they get sized into usually small, medium, large, sometimes extra large. And of course, the American culture a lot of times goes for the large, but a lot of the other cultures that really know chestnuts know that sometimes the more medium-sized nuts are actually sweeter and tastier. So you can't really judge by size. You'll notice in one of the chestnuts there on the left side, there's a hole. We're going to talk about that issue in a minute. That's a weevil hole, which is something that needs addressing with chestnuts. Okay, so the value of the chestnut. These are powerful statements. The fact that the U.S. is importing 88% of the chestnuts that it consumes is just on a numbers level, a major flag for jumping into a lucrative market. Now, chestnuts they need care when they get harvested. They need to stay moist and they need to stay cool. And the nuts that are being exported from Europe and Asia typically are not being handled well. So when they arrive, they are not in prime condition at all. So you're actually mostly getting inferior chestnuts that are being imported, whereas we can easily produce the chestnuts in this country at a higher quality and at less cost as far as transportation goes. So huge market potential there. There's a lot of room. There's a lot of safety to get into this market because 88% is not being filled. You know, there's not millions of acres being planted right now, which gives security to go ahead and plant these now, knowing there's still going to be a strong market for it. And my estimate is that the interest in chestnuts is going to increase in the future as we become more aware of the nutrient density in foods. We are not far away from having the ability to take our phones to stores, point it at foods, and get the nutrient density level in the foods. This technology exists. It's open source. It's coming very soon to your phone. And when you can go into the store and you can look at the nutrient density of foods, you know, if you have the money, you're going to buy the one that's going to feed your body best. And tree crops in general are higher nutrient density. Chestnuts, high nutrient density. So you know, it's gluten-free. You know, it's just this awesome food that we're going to honor more and more in this country, which is going to create more market demand. So really, I think it's very smart move to be getting into chestnuts, even just economically. And those co-ops around the country that have been doing chestnuts now for 10 and 20 years are all expanding, all trying to get more acres going. They're selling out from harvests in October before, you know, Christmas time, before the end of December, they're selling out. So they're looking actively to keep, you know, growing chestnuts, getting new producers in. You know, this market is going up. Okay, there's my shtick for it. All right, let's see what else. It just says, you know, where a lot of chestnuts coming. Interesting enough, Thailand is becoming a big producer, and I think that's must be in the north where it's much cooler and higher altitude, because as far as I know, chestnuts do not grow in the tropics. So it must be a higher land. So the price can, depending on how, you know, if you're doing conventional, non-organic, and you're doing it wholesale, you know, the cheapest you would find is 75 cents a pound, though I've almost never heard it that cheap. The co-ops in this country usually pay at least $1.50 for wholesale conventional chestnuts. It can easily go up to $4.50. And I know one grower who's selling organic chestnuts was selling them to Whole Foods for $6 wholesale. That's big money, especially when you realize that your, you know, per acre production can average at 3,000 pounds, right? Do the math on that. What is that? $18,000 potential from, you know, a mature chestnut acre. And that's wholesale. What if you have access to retail or you pick and it's organic? You could easily double that. You saw that slide in the beginning, $19.99 a pound store, organic grocery store. I'm not promising that, but the potential is there to create niche markets in this, especially in the organic niche market. Okay, let's keep going. All right, let's talk a little bit about planting, preparing. You know, our style of chestnuts is a little different than the land-grant universities. We work holistically. We work with permaculture. We work with regenerative landscape design. So it may vary a little bit from what you might hear otherwise. You know, conventional orcharding, even for chestnuts, is, you know, it's herbicide, it's drip irrigation, you know, it's pretty much barren soil that you have to supplement. That's not our style. It's high energy input, and it doesn't really support, you know, longevity and tree health. So we take a more passive approach, especially with water harvesting. So passive water harvesting is a key element design on most landscapes. Especially anything with a slope where water is sheeting down and off very quickly. We want to slow that water down. We want to slow it, spread it, and sink it. And one of the most effective ways to do that is with swales on contour, which are basically a basin and a berm on contour, which means it's staying perfectly perpendicular with the changing slope. So here you can see this picture is at Middle Creek Farm, which is, you know, sort of the home base for silviculture. And you can see here how it curves and it keeps following the changing landscape. so that as water comes down, it falls into that basin. And since it's on contour, it's not being pushed in any direction. So it stops and it sinks in and it harvests into the groundwater and the water lens there, so that the trees, not only on that berm, but for 30, 40 feet down slope, get hydrated. And the number one ingredient in fertile soil is water, consistent water. So we're building soil fertility, and we're creating a constant moisture content, which the trees thrive on, versus relying on, constant water inputs. That plus really good mulching will help us, even in years of establishment, with dry periods, can dramatically reduce our inputs. So this is a key design. There's a few variations of the swale. This is from a workshop we did out at Middle Creek Farm, and that's an A-frame, geniusly called an A-frame. And it is, it's a way to find level on a hillside very easily. It's the same as a transit. It's the same as an engineering transit. It's going to find the exact same contour for you, but you can make this and use this by yourself. Go out there and flag how to find contour on your land. Look it up, Google it, look at a couple of my books. I always talk about how to use and make an A-frame. It's a very empowering tool. Here is a swale that was hand dug. The first one I showed you a couple back was dug by a mini excavator. We did like at least 5 acres of swales in one day with a mini excavator. So you'd be surprised how much can get done with a small machine, but then you can also do it by hand. This was done by Howard County EcoWorks, which is an organization we partnered with to do these chestnut plantings here in Maryland and Howard County. Very successful program. Got a lot of homeowners going with not just chestnuts, but these passive earthworks that harvest water. You can do this on a different level with just a plow and a tractor. What we call a double bottom plow can go ahead and create that basin, that furrow, and throw the soil up on the downhill. Typically, you would plant on that berm, but you could also elect to plant it just past that berm, whatever will help make sense with your management, mowing, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll throw out there that we really only mow our orchards twice a year, and both of those are right before harvest. So the hay or whatever wants to grow is allowed to grow there and create wild diversity during the season, not affecting our trees that are mulched and have plenty of water. And so the maintenance, again, is very minimal once these trees are established. And if you don't really have the space or the inclination to do swales or earthworks, creating these larger mulch rings helps a lot, because they act like big sponges. As water's moving across the landscape and hits a large mulched area, that will sponge and hold water. And all of that organic material encourages and supports fungal networks. So almost all of our woody species and trees developed in forests with fungal systems and networks. They're key to their health and well-being. By creating large fungal areas of organic matter, we support the tree health to be more resilient against a lot of the challenges that it could have. So key is broad and deep mulch, whether that's wood chips, mulch, or straw. And I guess leaves, you got to be careful with leaves, maybe shred them first. Leaves can create a hard mat sometimes that actually gets impenetrable, but you got the idea. What we also do is we plant at the same time the mulch and the nutrients in the form of companion plants. Sometimes, in permaculture, we call these guilds. In this picture, you can see we're planting a bare root chestnut seedling. So typically, you're planting 1 or 2 year old seedlings. 1 year olds are usually plenty fine. They're so fast growing. You really don't want to start with larger trees ever, because if you're starting with a larger tree, then the roots have been compromised, whether they've been dug up and cut off or they've been grown in a pot. That compromise shows up in later tree health. So you're really, when you're shopping for a tree or growing a tree, it's all about root health. So younger, smaller is better. So in this picture, we're doing a bare root 1 year, Chinese chestnut seedling we got from Route 9. And at 45-degree angles next to it, you see our two whips. One of them is a false indigo bush, which is a woody perennial from the plains, fixes nitrogen through its roots. The other one's a black locust, which also fixes nitrogen through its roots. So we plant those in the same hole. The chestnut goes vertical, it gets tubed. These stay at a 45-degree angle. And as they grow up, we're able to come through and we're able to cut them back. And by cutting back those companion plants, we are dropping nutrient-rich mulch to feed the topsoil. And at the same time, you're cutting back the top, the roots underground die off and release nitrogen, right in a bioavailable form for the chestnut tree or whatever tree to absorb it. It's awesome. You cannot improve on this by bringing in organic material and fertilizer. I mean, it's great to do both, but this is genius. This is nature. This is how systems are symbiotic together. We can put plants together to create their needs. It reduces our inputs and our needs to be taking care of things, and it does a better job than we could anyway. So it really kind of challenges our mind of competition, but this is a great, simple system. And for the false indigo bush, the deer do not eat it. They will nibble back the black locust. And sometimes it's too much and sometimes it's helpful. Maybe that's just the right amount to keep it from, you having to maintain it. But certainly the indigo bush, which is very easily obtained. I know the Maryland nursery typically sells them for $1 a piece. So highly recommend considering those at the time. And then we also, well, I guess I'll get to that in a minute. So then we put a tree tube on it, and not just any tree tube. We use the Plantra tree tube, and this is the new generation of tree tubes, very different than the old, what were called tree killer tubes. These have really good ventilation in them. They have a fiberglass stake that moves so that the stem of the tree can strengthen. And we've had a lot of success, and a lot of other chestnut growers are having a lot of success as well using the Plantra tree tubes. They cost a little bit more, but they are well worth it. In the right conditions and good genetics, we've seen 1-year-old seedlings come out of the top of a 5-foot tube in 1 year. You can easily get 2 or 3 foot of growth a year on a chestnut, and sometimes 4 or more. So again, very fast growing. The tube also really helps keep the trunk growing, tall and straight. It reduces the need to prune, keeps the deer out. And then once it comes to the top of the tube, that's about the right height for beginning to have your trees branch out. Whereas they could easily start branching out lower if they did not have a tube. And if you're going to be mowing or moving through that zone, it's better to have your branches start more at 5 feet tall. So yeah. And here's a wonderful diagram by Nicole. And it's just kind of showing a little bit of the idea of creating companion plants, how it's good to do really good mulching, sheet mulching using cardboard. Can reduce the amount of material you have to put down. So if you've got a harder to reach area or a lot of trees, and you're like, well, I can't wood chip that 8-10 inches deep by 4 or 5 feet wide. Putting down cardboard and straw is very lightweight, quick, and easy, and will reduce do a lot of the same benefits. Not last quite as long, and maybe you have to resupply straw after a year or two. But really what we're after here is just getting that consistent organic matter. And then that should only be a stopgap measure until you can get ground covers and other plants creating, what we call a living green mulch. And our favorite plant for that is running comfrey. A lot of people are familiar with standing comfrey, which is a great, what we call a dynamic accumulator. in the sense that it pulls up a lot of minerals deep in the subsoil into its leaves, which then die and feed the topsoil. It's also an amazing pollinator and just a great biomass plant. So the running comfrey is a runner. It's a ground cover. It's an awesome, very opportunistic plant that grows to about 20 inches tall. It shoots up early in the spring, puts out some of the first abundant flowers for the bees. Awesome bee fodder plant, and can usually outcompete most grasses. So we get this in typically maybe a year after we've mulched it and let that mulch die down a bit. Then we get our more permanent green, ground cover in there, green mulch, and let this, run over the whole area, holds moisture, it's feeding the topsoil, it's conditioning the soil, it's pulsing its leaves and feeding, the plants. It's just phenomenal. We love it, especially on a little bit of a larger acreage or, more trees. These really are great helpers. Another wonderful illustration by Nicole. This is, kind of expanding the concept a little bit more, and creating diversity in an agroforestry system. Agroforestry is tree crops, sometimes mixed with animals, sometimes mixed with annual crops or other crops between your rows. So this is also where you could fill in the economic gap of planting chestnuts, which can take about 9 or 10 years to create a return on investment. And you could do 40 foot between rows. And in that 40 foot, you could do your annual crops if that's what you're doing. You could do hemp. You could do brambles, raspberries, you pick, and economize on that space while your chestnuts are coming in for about 9 or 10 years, when they would start to shade that zone out. But then you're going to start ticking up in your chestnut harvest. So economically, this can be grafted into even the short term. And again, a great resource for a lot of this, aside from silviculture, is the Savannah Institute. So the Savannah Institute is a fabulous nonprofit focused on tree crops, agroforestry, and again, making this, very economically viable and approachable. So I also recommend their resources. And then if you don't have the bandwidth to do any of what I just mentioned, and you just got to get out there and you want to plant. This was a cornfield. It was a big acreage. We planted 20 acres of mixed nuts. And the reality was, that we couldn't really, actually, this is a bit of a floodplain, but a floodplain that drains. That's important. So it was a really healthy soil. So, waterworks weren't necessarily essential, but we did end up mulching these. We used a lot of wood chips and we mulched 4 or 5 foot diameter, 10, 12 inches around every single tree. And another benefit of having the tree tube is being able to do that, because you don't really want your organic matter riding up on your stems of your trees. It'll rot them. But with the tree tube, it's easy to mulch and move, because it doesn't pile up and rot the stem. So, there's ideal, and then sometimes there's realistic, and the chestnuts are very hardy. And, if we have years of pretty consistent moisture, establishment won't be a problem. But if you are able to do earthworks, especially on any kind of slope, you will improve your production and your tree health and your harvests in the long run. All right, so where do we start? You can start by purchasing nuts of high quality genetic material. For example, Route 9 Cooperative, which I'll talk about in a minute, sells nuts. Red Fern Farm out in Iowa sells nuts. They go very quickly, seed nuts. Silviculture in the future will probably most likely be selling seed quality nuts. We're growing out a lot of our own trees for the co-op. So you can always check with us too first to see if we have improved genetic seedlings. But you can also begin to grow out your own. And this is another cool design workshop that we did at Silviculture a couple years ago, is a pallet nursery. Using pallets, putting in, some kind of fabric in there, ideally something you recycle, filling that. We did the very bottom with wood chips, almost like a little hugelkultur, And then we put like a nice compost topsoil mix in that, seeded our nuts very closely. And the beauty of this is it has a really nice loose soil to grow down into quickly. And then when it comes time to take the trees out, we screwed these pallets together. So all we have to do is unscrew one side, and then we can very easily tease and pull out full, beautiful roots on the plants. So I think you get about 50 trees in a pallet nursery like this. Very cool, very efficient design on a smaller scale. On a larger scale, we've just created these beds at Middle Creek Farm. It's the last couple of weeks for this year. Actually, we're also growing out hazelnuts, seedlings from Rutgers University. So we're not strictly chestnuts. We're also working with improved genetics of hazelnuts, hickories, pecans, black walnuts. But really, the chestnut is the leader in productivity and economics at this stage. But this bed could also be for chestnuts. It's a great design. It creates a raised bed that also has a lot of moisture held thanks to the straw bales. It holds more moisture in that zone. It's very loose soil that can grow roots quickly. And then again, when we're ready to harvest, we just pull the bales away and we can tease out full roots. So, we're working with, trialing some of these very easy and ingenious designs, with silviculture. When you come out to our workshops, you get to see and learn a lot of these things as well. The swales, the nursery startup. So we do have a hands-on workshop. We've pushed it back into early May. So the one we were going to do on Sunday is pushed back. So do consider coming if you can. All right, so harvesting nuts. This is a nut wizard. Those are black walnuts, but they can also be used for picking up chestnuts. One of the things that we really like about the chestnut is that it is comparable to hand harvest as it is to machine harvest. Personally, I would much rather pay someone to do something a machine can do. And in the case of chestnuts, generally speaking, they are proving to be about the same economically. But the difference is that hand harvesting chestnuts creates lots of employment. And going into a future where we're likely to have a lot more unemployment, this is a big bonus. To be able to create that employment. And not just for orchard trees, but, the co-op, is likely going to support people harvesting, wild hickories, black walnuts, and bringing them in. So it's going to create, an independent employment situation. Again, going to be very important in the future. So just a little bit on hand harvesting. Typically in the chestnut orchards, we'll go along and hand pick them. If they're in the burrs, you can kind of smush it a little bit with your foot and pick the nuts out. Sometimes the nuts are already free, of the burrs. So, yeah. Small scale budgets. Some of this information is from the University of Missouri. They have an whole agroforestry sector out there, which I think is really cool, albeit land grant, style, but there's still a lot to glean from it. Small scale budgets, it's been kind of estimated that to really kind of get into this on an economic return level, that 3 acres is kind of the beginning point. That said, of course, you're going to, make income from even having 2 trees. And you do need at least 2 for cross-pollination. More the merrier. But, some rough ideas. The installation is going to vary depending on, are you doing it all yourself? Or are you hiring people to do it? But it can be as low as, $2,000 or 2 and a little bit, up to more if you're hiring and paying somebody else out. But those costs are recouped usually by year 9. By year 10, you're starting to, get a good ROI. You're getting a return on investment. And that only increases as it goes up. And again, we're talking generations of income making, potentially hundreds of years for those who continue to work these orchards. So money well spent, if you asked me. Let's see what else is in here.
Michael, I also just wanted to give you a little heads up on the time. It's 6:50. We wanted to have a little time for Q&A, just giving you a heads up.
Well, shucks. I got a lot to talk about. Okay, well, we have a document that's getting ready to be released. If you're watching this at a later date, it's probably already on our website, that we've compiled a lot of information outlining, what are these chestnuts? What are the ways to start with them? What are the economics, input and outputs for the chestnut? So we have a wonderful resource coming soon to silvoculture.org. So stay tuned for that. I was just going to share a little bit about some of the different co-ops that you could research. In the meanwhile, again, Route 9 Cooperative is one of the closer, to the style or to the genetics that we're working with. We learn a lot and get a lot of learning from them. The Prairie Grove Chestnuts growers out there in Iowa, that's Ken Wall of Red Fern Farm. Red Fern Farm is a great website to learn from. They're doing agroforestry U-pick. They're doing chestnuts, persimmons, aronia berries, pawpaws, all the things that we love as well. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there. These are slides talking about that. The weevil is an issue to consider. We do a hot water dunk, so there are pretty straightforward ways to deal with the weevil as it gets harvested. If you hot water dunk them, you can arrest their development and keep a viable seed nut for either planting again or for storing. So it's just something to know about, but it's something that's very manageable. This is just some of Greg Miller's site, some of his tree stocks, some of the value-added products. Treeborn is up in Michigan. Michigan State is pumping a lot of resources into growing chestnuts. They are really going for it as a whole state. Some other issues I mentioned earlier: the blossom end rot. Certain genetics are that are being discovered to help with this. Again, just something to be aware of. This is the DESDA systems in Europe that are nut systems with animals in them, very successful. The animals that come off of these systems get high dollar. These are very economically successful systems that we can have, that we can do with a little bit of time and investment. Another wonderful silvoculture resource is our brochure, which also gives a good, quick educational input about chestnuts. We would be happy to send these out in some sort of bulk. If you have outlets for them, we're not really wanting to send one or two out, but if you have places to share these, or communities, or if you're doing events or something, we can send you, chunks of these. And there we go. That's my last slide. So let's see what the Q&A is.